You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, Colin Piper. And we come to that part of the story which is best known and most gloriously celebrated by Jews and Christians alike. For us Christians, there is a real poignancy. And as I go through this podcast telling of the preparation of the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, bear in mind that we as Christians believe this was the very spot upon which God the Father allowed his Son, Jesus Christ, to be sacrificed for us. Patriarch, chapter 7, part 3. Abimelech, Abraham's friend and fellow God-fearer, had made a promise with him which meant that he was no longer an alien in a foreign land. But long before Abimelech, the god they both feared, had made a bigger promise to him and his descendants. And that was significant to a man who otherwise was so very much alone. If he had no one else to enjoy this place with, he had his God, and they would enjoy this place together. As he travelled through the land, Abraham had built altars upon which to worship his God. Now it was time to build again, but it wasn't an altar or indeed anything so temporal that Abraham decided to build. There was something else he missed about Mamre, perhaps the only thing he did truly miss. He could never in his lifetime recreate the great trees of Mamre, but he did what he could, and he planted a grove of tamarisk trees. Maybe his crag climbing days were over, but nothing could stop him creating with his God a temple for them to meet and for him to worship his Lord. It was a temple befitting this stage of his life. Beersheba was his land, and so for the first time he was able to plant something. It was a temple also befitting this place and befitting his God. It would be a beautiful, living temple which would long survive him and his descendants. It would keep growing and recreating itself as long as the Lord decreed it should, and as such it was fitting, because the more Abraham in his old age became aware of his mortality, the more one attribute of God became more and more significant to him. His God was eternal. For 20 years Abraham lived there, and for 20 years called upon the name of the eternal God, till finally, one day, the Lord called upon his name. Abraham, God said. And the patriarch replied, "Here I am." Oh, for 20 years, all heaven had watched an old man delight in his God. And over 20 years, an intimacy had been built between a man and his God which the world hadn't known since the great flood. It was an intimacy built upon respect and fear, but increasingly expressed in love and relationship. The patriarch was used to receiving respect and affection from others, and now he'd come to know his God in the same way, his Lord and patriarch, even Father. Abraham had few he could tell of this level of intimacy, and those he did, he wasn't sure would totally grasp it. This was the sort of understanding which could only be experienced, not explained, and the experience only came through pain. He wondered if only those whose spirits were poor and whose lives had become devoid of all else could fully grasp how God could be their Lord and everything. Then again, perhaps it was only the fatherless who would most easily appreciate him as father. There were few, therefore, who could begin to understand these things, and now even Abraham was to discover that his journey, far from nearing its end, was still just beginning. In years to come, God would allow another patriarch who feared him to be tested by the forces of evil so heaven could see his faithfulness. But on this occasion, it wasn't the forces of evil which tested Abraham, nor heaven which needed to see. Rather, God himself tested this patriarch so that his old friend himself could see. The test the Lord had in mind would show him just how far he had come, and yet how much further he could still go. And yet there was still more to it than that. This test would speak through 2,000 years of history, and then on for 2,000 years more. But however historic, and indeed horrific, the challenge was to be, the words themselves were like any words, straightforwardly spoken into time and space. God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." And Abraham obeyed. The Abraham who 20 years before had run from God to Gerar and from Abimelech to Beersheba, after 20 years of calling upon the name of the eternal God, had discovered a level of faith few can fathom. Early the next morning he got up and saddled his donkey, just like many an old man did that day, except that he was a patriarch set upon sacrificing his only son. The party which set out from Beersheba that morning on the 42-mile journey up country to Moriah was a small one. Along with the patriarch went one who travelled a long way with his master. Abraham had no one like Eliezer. These past 50 years they'd shared everything together, the joys, the hardships, the good times and the bad. And ultimately they had shared faith. Now at this moment of the greatest test of his faith, it was only natural for Abraham to choose his most loyal and dearest household member. 2 other travellers completed the party, one younger, one older. The younger, Isaac, was 35. The older was the servant his father had given him to mentor and tutor him in the way that he should go. However, on this occasion, the tutor set out on the journey perplexed and unsure of how to mentor his charge. It was a mystery to him. It wasn't the early start which surprised him, that was quite normal, but the lack of prior notice, preparation or explanation wasn't. Like Eliezer, he knew the patriarch well, but this morning he couldn't read the father, and therefore had nothing to tell the son, beyond what he could glean for himself. And Isaac had indeed worked out that they were off to a sacrifice. Their donkey carried firewood, and it was a significant bundle, suggesting an equally significant sacrifice. Too much surely for a lamb, and in any case they hadn't taken a lamb with them. It was all a mystery to the young man too, but no more of a mystery than so much of his father's life. Over the years, Isaac had spent more and more time with his father and loved, trusted, even idolized him. In his world and the worlds of all those with whom he interacted, there was no one like his father. In one way, the gulf between them seemed unbridgeable. He was not only unlike anyone Isaac had ever met, he was more than anything he could ever imagine himself becoming. He was heroic, but it was a heroism not based upon the respect he engendered in those around him, but something deeper, more inwardly defined and spiritually discerned. Over the years, Isaac had strived to know this depth for himself, but had come to realize that the 100-year start his father had upon him wasn't easily made up. And yet, in another way, the time he'd spent with his father had both borne fruit and built an affinity. What is more, it was an intimacy not based upon their relationship so much as their relationship with his father's God. In worship, all the differences in age and experience seemed to count for nothing. Together they called upon the name of the eternal God, and as they did, they were one. But now all Isaac knew was that they were heading off to worship. So he went, trusting in his father and his Lord. Abraham was aware of this trust, even adulation, but as they set out, he chose not to dwell upon it. The busyness of a hasty departure allowed little time to dwell upon much, and this suited Abraham perfectly. The problem was that as the road opened up before the travellers, so did the time to think. For 2 days they journeyed in silence. All somehow knew that this was too sacred an occasion for trivial chat, but only one was aware of its true enormity, and he didn't understand it enough to feel able to communicate it even to those he'd chosen to travel this way with him. Abraham pondered again and again the words of the Lord. He hadn't expected to hear the voice of the Lord that night, but then God never did speak to a cue. More to the point, he would never have expected to hear those words from the Lord any night. Perhaps a renewal of the covenant or affirmation of promises, but not this, and certainly not now. Life was settled and secure. Over the years, God had kept his promises to him, and with some ups and downs, he supposed he'd become faithful to his God. The sun was finally setting on his journey, and he'd laid down his head, if not to sleep, at least to rest. But now the Lord was asking him to journey again, the most demanding of journeys yet, a journey of faith like no other. As Abraham left Beersheba, he remembered that departure from Ur 50 years before, and then from Haran those few years after that. But neither of those journeys could compare with this one. Then he'd headed off to an unknown distant destination. This time it was a relatively short trek to a place with which he was vaguely familiar. Then he'd headed off in search of the future, and would find in it a miracle birth. Now he was going to give it all up to death. He couldn't imagine any words from God which would test his faith like these, and it appeared that the Lord knew that too. He'd spoken slowly, deliberately, even provocatively. "Take your son," God had said. Isaac was his pride. "Your only son," God had said. Isaac was all he had left, his everything, his only hope. "Isaac," God had said. Isaac means he laughs. He was his delight, his joy. "Whom you love," God had said. Passionately, thought Abraham. The Lord knew, and yet could give the order to take, to go, and to sacrifice, as though he asked Abraham to do little more than boil some tea. But this was to be no symbolic act like a further circumcision. It was to be a burnt offering, complete and utter destruction. It was inconsistent, irrational, and wrong. And yet Abraham knew his God, and he knew his voice. And more to the point, he knew his hearts. He'd come to know it well enough, particularly over these last 20 years of worship, to embark upon this one last journey, his greatest and most demanding journey of faith yet. He believed. Each evening he set up camp and watched the sun set, secure in the knowledge it would rise again the following morning. In the same way he believed his God. He didn't know why the sun went down or how it rose again, but he knew it would. And he didn't know why the Lord had asked him to do what he had, nor how he would work it out. But he knew he would. Each morning of the journey, the sun did rise, and on the third day, when Abraham looked up, he saw what the dusk of the previous evening had hidden, Mount Moriah. As the light increased, so did the vista to reveal what Abraham already knew but hadn't really studied before. He saw that Moriah wasn't just one peak, but a range of peaks which bisected two others. It slowly rose northwards between two valleys, and this morning it silently beckoned him, so he rose and stood before it and looked. There was a mystery about this place. It was both holy and dreadful all in one. Here was a Canaanite city, and here children had been sacrificed to unknown and unknowable gods. Abraham shuddered, first at the thought, and then again at a subsequent thought. But here too Melchizedek had lived and worshipped the living God, and once more faith rose in Abraham's heart. His God had overcome evil, and as he ventured on with his face set like a flint towards the hills before him, he had faith that here, on this spot, his God would overcome evil again. He didn't know how, he just believed. The four reached the spring at the foot of the first peak, Gihon, just before the gates of the city of Jabez. It was still very early and cool, but the party took the opportunity to refill their water bottles. Abraham then unloaded from the donkey some embers he'd taken from the dying campfire that morning, and also the wood they'd carried from Beersheba. From here on they would be climbing and needed to go on foot. More significantly, though, the servants were told that from here, father and son would be going alone. The two faithful retainers stood in the foothills, knowing that somehow this moment was poignant beyond any other, and yet without further comprehension they felt helpless and even strangely tired. Their master looked at them warmly and spoke kindly to them, a command which, although seemingly perfunctory, somehow suggested an unlikely intimacy and appreciation. Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then come back to you. Both servants felt disappointed about being excluded, but all the same reassured by the tone of the words, which seemed to induce an even greater weariness upon them. They tethered the donkey to an olive tree where he could stand in the shade during the day, and each found another tree under which to rest, nearby on the lower slopes of the eastern mount, which was covered with olive trees. Abraham watched them settle and loved them. He needn't have brought them on this journey, really, but he just wanted them with him. They couldn't grasp what he was to do and couldn't walk the last part of the road with him, but he was just glad they were here with him. And it was their presence which had drawn out of him the words of faith he, more than anyone, needed to hear. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. They really come back? If he obeyed God's command, logically they wouldn't both return. But then again, it was equally illogical that God would allow, let alone command him to sacrifice Isaac. It was also crazy that the only reasonable explanation was that he'd got it horribly wrong. He'd either misheard or misjudged his God. Either he was mad or his God was bad. And yet in his spirit he knew neither of these options was right. And that left just one possibility, the one he'd spoken out. They would worship, even sacrifice, even Isaac. And yet they would return. Again, it wasn't rational. But then if Isaac's birth had been the result of one miracle, why couldn't his death result in another? As he spoke it, he believed it. But that didn't necessarily make it any easier. The son bent over before his father, who placed the wood for the burnt offering across his shoulders, and then, struggling under the weight, he began the climb up the hill. His father watched him and grieved. For all his faith, he was watching his son walk to his death. Worse still, he was to give his only son over to death. He carried the burning coals to light the fire, and a knife to pierce his heart. Slowly they climbed out of the Kidron Valley, and up above Jebus the sun was now rising, and the increasing heat only added to the discomfort of the climb. It took all their concentration and energy to ascend the hill, and no words were passed between the two until Isaac stumbled and slumped down on one side of the rough path. Abraham sat down beside him, and together they rested and looked out across the Hinnom Valley westward towards Mount Zion. As their breath was restored, and just as Abraham was about to ask his son to carry on, Isaac spoke up. "Father." The title formed a question, as yet unspoken, but already anticipated. "Yes, my son." Never more father and son than at this moment. Never before had they so needed to be than this moment. The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? The question cut to the heart. Abraham wanted to scream it out to his father, so that it echoed across this wretched hill. "Where is the lamb? Where?" But however much he wanted to cry out, he knew he could only trust his father, and in the same way he could only ask his son to trust him. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Once again, the old patriarch and prophet spoke words of faith, words which would indeed echo round these hills through history itself, until fulfilled by an eternal Lamb who stood outside of history. But right there and then, the words had a more immediate effect, and motivated the two of them to get up and go on together, each emboldened and reassured.
You're listening to Patriarch the podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support those working with young people across the world.